Welcome to Networking and Security. In this video, I'll cover the Switchvox network configuration, proxies and SSLs, access control, including the IP banhammer, our phone networks, and I'll touch briefly on TLS connectivity. Please note that this particular video pertains to on-prem Switchvox users, with the exception of the IP blocking section, which would apply to both versions of the Switchvox. However, if you are a cloud Switchvox user, then you can skip on to the next video in the series. Starting with network configuration, you can join me here under Server, Networking, and IP Configuration. Switchvox IP configuration can be summed up as the network center for the Switchvox system. The defaults seen here are used for external SIP access, communication with SIP providers, and even web access to the Switchvox. For specific ports and protocols that these defaults provide, head over to the help icon, where you'll see what exactly this default networking is used for. In addition, being able to reach the IPs listed here must be allowed on your external firewall and also through the access control on the Switchvox, which is Switchvox's internal firewall, which we'll look at later in this video. While this information is assigned by DHCP, whether it's dynamic or it's a reservation that you set up before provisioning the Switchvox or entering in that static IP from the initial installation, that's what should be reflected here. Now, when you need to change that information, you can go ahead and do so by popping in the new gateway address, your DNS servers, and the IP address and net mask. In my case, the Switchvox IP address is a static IP opposed to DHCP. This isn't a specific tutorial on networking, but generally you'll have a static IP address for the Switchvox, so that doesn't change. Now, that's not to say that DHCP cannot have reservations assigned specifically to the Switchvox, so certainly assign that as you prefer. In the case where you are behind a firewall using an internal IP address and gateway for the Switchvox, we'll need to enable NAT port forwarding so that the audio goes in and out of the system as expected. In this case, our external IP address box has appeared. That's because NAT needs to know how to translate the traffic between the external and internal addresses. Switchvox is already aware of its public IP address, so I'll use the lookup external IP. This should be a static IP address, and if your Switchvox is behind a firewall and port forwarding is enabled for the Switchvox to communicate, then it would be the external IP address of your firewall. For your external firewall to forward this traffic, you'll have to enable port forwarding on the firewall to the Switchvox, or allow the ingress-egress traffic through to the Switchvox, depending on your setup. So if NAT is actually needed, you would again just put external IP address as the public facing IP, allow NAT port forwarding in most cases, and your ETH0 IP address will be your local based IP, and this will allow the SIP packets to do the translation from external to internal. Coming down to advanced options, I can provide a label for this network that'll be seen throughout the system. For reference, I've also got the host name. You'll likely want to ensure the host name is resolvable in the case where you want to have a valid SSL for users that are accessing, for example, the web GUI externally, or if you want to utilize TLS or secure SIP transport. The next two options, IPTOS, are related to QoS or quality of service when passing through a firewall or SBC. Now, that's beyond the scope of this video. If you have additional phones or equipment that reside on the internal network and need to communicate with the Switchvox, such as a VLAN or separate firewalled network, etc., you would want to add those additional local networks here so that they can be recognized by Switchvox and allowed access. So let's add the IP address and a valid net mask. ICE support is enabled by default, which is a protocol used for NAT traversal, ensuring that two-way audio communication is up and running smoothly. That includes with the Sangoma Talk softphone. As mentioned, this would need to be disabled if you are using a Sangoma SBC. Please refer to further documentation of the Sangoma SBC for these specific settings. I'm going to go ahead and save. Now expect this to take time. If all the settings are correct, it will update and refresh. If they're not correct, however, you may end up locking yourself out of this system. And unless you've got a virtual console that you can log into to fix networking on the Linux system directly, you would have to physically access the SwitchVox. Before making any changes to the network, take note of the notice sign at the top. That does a good job of reminding us that the network services will restart dropping active calls and completely taking the SwitchVox offline momentarily. With these settings in mind, let's head over to phone networks, where we can specify to phones where they'll get their information that may differ from this default setup. You may recognize this from a default Linux installation, with all networks being covered by the first in the row, internal being our main network, which was ETH0 that we just looked at under IP configuration. Well, the IP configuration section denotes how to access the SwitchVox web UI, as well as register and access the APIs such as phones would do, updating and getting firmware and so forth. Here we can control what the phones do on certain networks and permit or deny certain traffic from phones themselves. The host address is the local network that the handsets will be connecting to. These are generally local VPN, VLANs, anything that doesn't need to go through the external gateway in order to access the SwitchVox via a handset, unless we're talking about remote users. Now, we're not seeing any alt host address, which is a secondary proxy for phone registrations, because they haven't been added. While phone networks can generally be left to their default, there are instances where you would want to create additional phone networks. For example, all of your VoIP phones and devices are on an internal network, and all communications should stay internal, whereas an external VoIP provider, for example, would use the external network or externally facing network. In the case where you have remote workers connecting to the SwitchVox over some type of VPN or proxy where the internal IP address would hit the SwitchVox opposed to their external, you can create an additional network with common internal ranges or even specific IP addresses of the internal phone. No external IP should be added here, rather we'll create access control rules for those, which I'll show you in the next segment. Let's take a look at the detailed overview under Actions for this internal network, and we can see the settings that are assigned to it for SIP registration. Aside from the quick reference, we can modify the network, which gives us the same settings as if we were going to create a new network. As you can see, we can modify the phone network to have unique NTP servers and outbound proxies if this one will be accessing a Sangoma SBC and that proxy port. We can change the IP address at any time, and an alternate host can be specified as a failover when the primary IP cannot be reached. This will be provisioned into phones and including the Sangoma TalkPhone as its failover gateway. Note that some features for phones are unavailable while they're on the alternate host. Before moving on, we'll look at the direct port access. This is toggled on by default, and when not on, this means that phones will not have external access to certain ports and protocols that it needs, such as provisioning and firmware. As the help pop-up denotes, that would be port 80 for getting the firmware, and port 443 for getting additional files and accessing SwitchVox's API over SSL. Now, if the phones will not have access to those ports, it will default to getting that information over port 5060, which is not as reliable, but is available. Our advanced settings pertain to the retry time on failure for both the primary and the alternate hosts, any VLAN settings, which by default are LLDP, but you can specify manual VLAN IDs, the QoS priority, and some additional provisioning options, which are for more advanced users. With IPs, ports, and protocols fresh in mind, we can head over to Access Control. Under Server, Networking, Access Control. Access Control is SwitchVox's internal firewall and not only defines access control for providers, handsets, soft phones, and access to the web interface, to name a few, it also manages edge security if necessary, which includes the banning of bad actors over the SIP ports, After defined thresholds are hit, such as SIP registrations or even web login thresholds that trigger a ban on the IP address. We did cover unblocking IPs that have been banned, as sometimes a legitimate user is banned for misconfiguration, which results in a ban of their IP address unintended, or perhaps even the administrator gets blocked out from the web interface, has to then log in through another IP address, and then can unblock himself. So the rule names will match the IP configurations as covered earlier in this video, which results in the all networks and the local network. You'll see to the right of that, we've got a set of permissions defined by category, and those are either simply off or on, meaning access is allowed or denied. Now, of course, the strategy here depends on whether you want certain services to be accessed from certain networks. For example, you might only want SIP phones to access the Switchvox from the internal network or the local network, and would like to block SIP access from the all networks or external, but would like the web interface to be accessible from the external network. At this point, the best way to understand the flow here would be for me to give some examples. We'll use the local network in this scenario as the network that on-prem phones will connect to. In this rule, never block IPs is toggled to yes, which means that no local IP addresses will be banned. That could either be failed login attempts to the web interface, or it could be SIP phones attempting to register that trigger an IP ban. Those are disabled. What's allowed here are web admin portal access, NTP, SNMP services, but we'll also want to enable SIP and the web user portal so that local phones can register to the Switchvox, our users can access the user portal, and user API, which will allow phones to get their provisioning and firmware. Okay, let's save this. Now let's take a look at the all networks access control rule, which is covering all networks and all IP addresses, hence the 0.0.0.0. These are the rules for every IP address coming into the Switchvox. Assuming that all traffic is being port forwarded from your firewall, any IP address that would hit the Switchvox would be covered under these rules. Hence why I've got everything off except SIP. One thing to note that this action is editable, or this rule set is editable. However, there are requirements for this pencil to be enabled. This will be disabled if your IP address is not on a recognizable address, such as my third rule here with my remote IP address, with the specific permissions required. These requirements for the remote IP are web admin portal, admin API, and web user portal permissions. Now, ensuring I can modify all networks, here I'm able to allow such things as all SIP traffic from the outside, web admin portal, web user portal, for example. Now, this may not work for your particular needs, as it's opening up traffic all from the outside. Depending on what your external firewall is doing, everything you do here will be allowed from the outside. So use with caution if you're not going to set up individual IP addresses to access these resources from the outside and you're opening it all up. I just want to advise some caution. If you don't need remote SIP traffic or want to specify the IPs of the remote SIP traffic users, you can disable SIP. And you could, as just an example, open up the web user portal so that users can manage their extensions through /main remotely. So I'll leave it to you to devise your strategy here. I would not suggest enabling the never block IP addresses so that the Switchvox can manage things like enumeration, bad actors attempting to connect to the system. Remember, you'll have to go to the blocked IP section in order to unban any legitimate IPs. If someone's reporting that they can't access the Switchvox, that should probably be one of the first places that you go to troubleshoot. Now, if you'd like to have a little bit more of a secure environment than just allowing access through the all networks, which would cover, any remote users and providers, we can actually specify the external IP address of a remote user that needs to access the Switchvox. In this case, I'll walk through setting up my IP address so I can access the web admin portal remotely, as well as have my SIP phone communicating with the Switchvox remotely. Again, this is specifically my home IP address that I'm allowing through the Switchvox. External communications could include remote phone users as well as SIP providers. Alright, with demo IP in place, I want to allow web admin portal access as well as SIP, but I'm not going to allow web user portal access from external, but I will allow SIP phones to provision and receive updates. Now, alternatively, what you can do is set up specific rules for remote users by their external public IP address. This can get tricky if they have dynamic addresses, but if they're from a fixed IP location, you could set up that as an access rule. Now, bear in mind that these services represent also ports that need to be in and out of the Switchvox system, so although we've configured the Switchvox's internal firewall rules here, if you do have an external firewall on the edge of the network, you're going to need to allow that traffic in and out. There is a non-exhaustive list in the Sangoma knowledge base. Over at help.sangoma.com, I'm going to find my firewall rules by typing in firewall/NAT checklist. And again, this is a non-exhaustive list of ports and protocols, including a list of IPs for Sangoma softphone communications. I'll include a link to this for easy access in an area that will accompany this video if you're watching this on a platform that supports it. Now, with our rules in place and external access exposing the Switchvox, I would be right to assume that there probably are some nefarious actors that have already been banned. The way that's configured is by heading over to IP blocking options. You can see here the thresholds that are in place by default, such as login attempts before lockout, which equal 5. Login attempts before IP block is 10. Number of blocked IPs from the same network or trigger a netmask block is 25. That, of course, is for the web suite and API logins. Now, for SIP phone configuration and registration, the number of registration or invite attempts before that IP address is blocked is 5, and IPs from the same network that trigger a whole netmask block is 25. Feel free to increase and decrease these, of course, as needed. Now, we covered the IP ban list in some other videos, but in case you're here for the first time or need a refresher, let's head up to server and we can go down to blocked IPs under networking. And with the date range here, we can hone in on the specific time frame we'd like to view. The row contains an IP or net block that was blocked, the service specifically, so HTTPS, we know that's a web or API ban, SIP being a invite or registration enumeration, further details here, failed API login, and a failed SIP registration at the threshold we just looked at 5 times. Take a look under actions to view details. And in this case, it was a single IP address. It wasn't a range from a net block. They attempted to register with the account extension 2000, and the attempts would match the thresholds as well. And we can see here that they're blocked on all SIP ports, including the UDP, TCP, and even RTP ranges. Let's head back and take a look at the unblock under actions if we'd like to unblock that. Again, very quickly, sometimes you will block yourself out of the web interface. For example, you forgot your password and you get blocked. You would need to access the web interface for Switchvox through another IP address in order to get yourself into this interface to unblock yourself. Similar, a user may do the same after they forgot their password, or perhaps they have been registering incorrectly to the Switchvox and have got themselves into a SIP ban. So very easy to come here and remove them from that. Keep that in mind when a user says, I can't log in, or my phone's not working, my phone's not registering. You may want to come into here and check that out. Ask them what their external IP address is or internal IP if you've got blocking on the local network under access control. Next up, we'll look at web proxy and SSL certificates. We can manage Switchvox's web proxy and SSL settings from going to server, networking, HTTPS, and proxy. The proxy settings here are for those who have a web proxy in front of Switchvox. This will not only allow access to the Switchvox UI, the Switchvox APIs will also be behind this web proxy, which are used by mainly phones for provisioning and firmware updates. Although a valid SSL certificate is not required to access the Switchvox web UI and the APIs externally, These services still need to function, which is why we have the Switchvox manage toggle, yes or no. These services still need to run on secure ports in some instances, which is why Switchvox has a manage certificate, which can be toggled on or off. Keep this on if you'd like to access the services internally and won't have any outside communications, and turn it off if you've got a third-party verified certificate. You'll also need a valid certificate if you're using the mobile chat application. Certificates are verified against Mozilla's CA certificate store, so the intermediate CA certificate must link to either the Mozilla CA certificate store or to your own certificate authority. Before I show you that, let's talk about the implications of not having a certificate. First one that may be more obvious is when you try to sign into the web interface, whether it's an admin or it's a user, you would be expected to see this browser error explaining the connection is not private or secure due to the invalid certificate. That's because up here I'm still using the IP address and not a valid FQDN or certificate for that matter. If I click advanced, I would have to go ahead and say proceed to the login. Now, because the APIs are also secured by that SSL, we would expect to see certain applications, primarily the Sangoma desktop phone, give a similar certificate warning as seen here, which we can still override. Again, if it's just internal traffic and your users are aware to avoid confusion, you could get away with this. However, the final implication is the lack of SSL for secure communications, or TLS. Depending on the SIP phone you're using, if we go over to phone settings, scrolling down to the provisioning, we will have our SIP transport where TLS SRTP is grayed out. Certain phones will allow you to override that by suggesting allow insecure SSL. However, this setting works for Sangoma based or Digium legacy phones. If you were to be using other phones, those settings would have to be managed independently. Lastly, on the soft phone settings page, our SIP transport also contains TLS SRTP, which is grayed out. You should note that the port and protocol is different from UDP 5060 for regular SIP transport. Voice would now be coming over port 5061 TCP. That'll have to be allowed on your firewall. For mobile, not only will you need that valid SSL for TLS, but you're going to need an FQDN, so there's a valid certificate to attach to the FQDN, of course. In order to enable SSL on a valid FQDN or fully qualified domain name, I'll have to switch my hostname from the assigned DHCP hostname that we see here. Okay, getting back to it, if you are going to manage your own certificate through a third party, you can go ahead and disable the Switchvox manage certificate down here, and you'll see the new prompt boxes to enter your certificate information, starting with the certificate. I'll enter mine in pen format. Now the private key, I'm going to go ahead and put in my Cloudflare intermediate certificate and hit save. Now, it's highly unlikely that your certificate authority will not be on the Mozilla CA list of intermediaries. However, in such a case, the CA certificate can be uploaded manually by you on this Certificate Authorities tab. There are other instances where you've generated your own CA certificate where your server is the CA itself. This is done for all sorts of reasons related to internal applications and internal security where you manage your own certificates. In either case, that would be uploaded here, of course. To do that, you can just hit the add another cert, give it a label and the certificate itself, and then hit save. Note here that the network is restarting and it will take your Switchvox offline. And all is well with my new CA certificate. Okay, now that the certificate has been successfully installed, we have a notification in the notifications bar. Let's take a look. SSL certificate host mismatch. However, I am using the FQDN above, so let's see what the details are. So the main phone network is still using the IP address instead of the FQDN. That should be easily resolvable. I'll need to change this hostname address here. Now I'm going to use the IP address as the alternate host in case something happens with the FQDN. I can use the IP address as a backup since I don't have any secondary failover. Well, that does look good, and the error message is still here. There is something that I can do to try to resolve this, which is regenerating the SSL certificate. While this command is off menu, so to speak, you just need to replace the URL to cmd equals SSL_expired and hit regenerate certificate. This change may require a sign-in prompt. If I head over to the extensions and go ahead and take a look at my phone settings, for Sangoma phones, I should expect to see that TLS option enabled now. I would change the port to 5061. I'm going to go over to the soft phone settings, and I should be able to see that as well now for the mobile soft phone. For any further troubleshooting, you can head over to the Sangoma knowledge base, how to generate an SSL certificate in Switchvox, for example, and the additional troubleshooting steps has some key information for anyone struggling with formatting or the process further. And lastly, let's talk about the Sangoma Talk Mobile under the extension settings. We can come under the Talk Mobile, which is handled by cloud provisioning through Sangoma. We can choose TLS for the SIP transport, and if you've got your own outbound proxy, SPC or otherwise, you can choose the TLS from here. I wanted to mention a little bit about physical security. There are a few maintenance activities you can do from the console, whether it's virtual or physical, with the keyboard plugged in. Certainly you'll want to consider not leaving keyboards plugged into the Switchvox so that it's easily accessible. There's a few options that we can do related to security and networking, such as configuring the network settings that we did inside of the admin. You can also set the admin password, which is handy if you do lose it or you get locked out. You can reset that certificate that we just covered prior, and we can restore the web admin access if you get locked out. Allow tech support access directly from here and unblock all local IPs, those on local IP ranges. It will not unblock or remove all of the external IPs from what would be probably nefarious actors. And that'll cover networking and security for the Switchvox device. Please use help.sangoma.com to expand further on any of these topics, and I'd like to thank you for sticking with me, and I'll see you in the next video.